I'll start with finite energy in the body, because I think that's very important to understand. So when I talk about finite energy in the body, what I'm talking about is literal electrical energy. So it's not some kind of esoteric, universal, whatever energy. I'm talking about the energy that drops from the cortex of the brain down into the neural pathways, right? So human beings are electric beings. You all know that, I think. And so we produce electrical energy. Hence, if you ever saw The Matrix, the reference to Neo as a copper top, meaning a battery. If you have never seen The Matrix, this is a very obscure, thing. But essentially, we produce electrical energy, and the electrical energy then gets put on the neural pathways where actions and processes and everything have been arranged as a pattern, right? And then from there, there's neurotransmitters and all of those kind of things. I'm not a neuroscientist, obviously, so my explanation probably lacks depth here. Not probably, lacks depth. But for what we are working with, all we need to know is that we produce a certain amount per second. And that amount per second has to power our entire body. And so it powers our entire body by giving us all the impetus for, let's say, the existence of the body, which we don't need to know anything about, right? We breathe, we digest, we're thirsty, we're hungry, like all of those things are done automatically. But then we have patterns that have been established through practice, meaning repetition. Everything in the human body, other than the basics, has been established through repetition. When you're a small child, you don't know how to pick up a cup, right? So you've seen this in babies or toddlers, right? They're like, and then eventually they get it, but they hit it, and then they get it and they hold it. But till they can get it and move it to their mouth and drink, that takes a little while. And it's repetition, repetition, repetition. Once it's been established, that's your pattern. This is true for everything, from the way we function in the world, but also our coping, our emotional stuff, our cognitive ability, the way we function. All of that has been established as neural pathways in the brain. And our electrical energy accesses all of that. So that's what I mean with finite energy. Essentially, we produce a certain amount, and that amount can't change. So, and that's the same for every human, more or less, right? Plus, minus a few percent. And that's what we have. So because of that, our body is extremely energy efficient. And what I mean with extremely energy efficient is that essentially the body knows where to pull energy from when extra energy is needed. So the way this goes, and you've heard me talk about this when people talk about being in their head versus in their body, because it's a fundamental principle of embodiment, and with that of sex, by the way, sex and intimacy. So essentially, wherever you need energy, the body will send the energy, and the body will pull the energy from where energy isn't needed. Right? Interestingly enough, they say about 80% of the energy we produce per second goes to thinking, and then the rest runs the body. Now that, of course, goes down if, let's say, you run a marathon or you do heavy sports, or you're, ideally when you have sex or things like that, where the energy goes into the lower body and goes towards movement and momentum. But if we just sit and think, which many of us do for long periods of time on the computer, on Zoom, in the office, making sure everything's okay, then the energy is needed here for thinking, for cognitive function, for speaking, for looking into a computer for hours on end. So all the energy moves from where it's not needed, which is you're seated, you don't need much energy in your lower body, to this part, neck, shoulders, always important. You can tell how much you spend time in your head, so to speak, from how tense this area is, and there's a reason for that. And then jaw, head, the whole area, and then thinking, doing, planning, organizing, getting shit done, what I call the go mode, requires a lot of energy here. So that's not a problem by itself, because that's what the body does. You need energy. The energy is pulled from where it's not needed. You use it, then it goes back to where it's needed next, or goes to where it's needed next. So that's energy distribution in the body, and finite amounts of energy. So the thing I want to say about that related to embodiment and intimacy is that, of course, our feeling sense of another, our ability to resonate, our ability to also polarize and feel, let's say, an erotic spark, our ability to have intuition, connection, all happens in the lower body, because that's where those faculties sit. That's also, of course, where reproductive organs sit, as a power center in the solar plexus. So this whole area here, for most people who spend a lot of their time here, isn't as muscular, so to speak, as the area up here, where you do a lot of repetitive thinking, doing, whatever is required. The more you do something, the stronger the pathway, or the stronger the muscle, so to speak. I always joke that most people look like bodybuilders who skip leg day energetically, right? They're really strong up here and really spindly down here. And that's why when people say these things like, I'm in my head, or I'm in my masculine, which is, by the way, grossly wrong, but that's besides the point right now. But if say you're in your head and you have all of this happen, then what that means is you have overtrained this area and undertrained this area. And that's not a problem if you understand energy distribution, because then you just start doing things that equally train the lower body to be able to conduct energy, which is some of the things we are doing here, of course. So then you were asking, some of that energy can be bound up, and that's, I think, an important and interesting thing to consider, both trauma therapeutically, but just from, let's say, living life optimally. And, I talked about this a bit in the description to this workshop, because when things happen to us as humans, we cope. This starts very early on. Typically, by individuation, you're already coping, right? So you figure out something's not quite right, and now you figure out how to cope with this. We all know that emotionally, of course, we all, there's the people pleasers, and there's the people who are anxiously attached, and there's the people who are doormats, which is a variation of people pleaser, and then there's people who are loners, or, like all kinds of things. Or more maladaptive coping would be people who do drugs or have addictions, or, all of those kind of things are coping mechanism against something that was wrong. And what's wrong can be both actual things that were wrong. You had abusive parents or neglectful parents, but it can also be things you perceive as wrong based on the fact that, of course, with 2 or 3, you think you're the center of the universe, and you don't consider that maybe you're not, right? So often we have coping mechanisms that come from us seeing ourselves in our environment in a certain way. So, some kids feel like they're not good enough, so they'll try very hard, or, somebody has to be very funny, or things like that. Those are coping behaviors. And so those coping behaviors, when you do them again and again, of course, also create patterns. But furthermore, if there was an injury, and the injury could be emotional, physical, spiritual, all the above, the body copes by creating a shape. Very much like if I just, during the rains, I slipped down a hill, I twisted my knee quite badly. And so now when I go to the osteopath, I favor the other knee, right? So then now this knee has more issues than this knee, because my body did some kind of, adaptation that now throws off my entire system, as one example, right? So I have to both stop bracing here and alleviate the extra tension from that knee in order to be okay again, right? The same can happen emotionally or, like I said, cognitively, or a combination thereof. So when we have these patterns where there's a clench, because something happened where we went, like I said, this can be an emotional thing or a physical thing, and a conglomerate, then that clench requires energy. And any chronic tension in the body requires energy. So if you have chronic tension on the pelvic floor, for instance, a certain amount of your per second energy is essentially bound up in clenching the pelvic floor. And so when you start releasing chronic tension patterns, or this is, a lot of what Leander's work is about, is like when you release certain tension patterns, which, by the way, you can only do through the body. You can talk about it till the cows come home, but you can only release it through the body. When you do that, you get a surge of extra energy. Sometimes, as you've probably noticed in body work and stuff like that, it's quite extreme, right? You suddenly comes up, or things like that. So that's why it's useful to free energy from clenches in the body, but it's also because it gives you more vitality and aliveness. But also, when you undo that tension pattern, which is a lot what we've done in the last few days, is look at, let's say, psycho-emotional tension patterns and how they affect you, and bring them to the surface, which is, of course, where they can be released, right? You always have to bring stuff out from the subconscious or unconscious into the conscious, hence the voices, for instance, right? And then you can deal with it, because now you know what the contraction actually feels like, versus just having some pain somewhere, right? Or the same with father, mother, right? Often lineage stuff, because it's so pre-verbal, has tension patterns, particularly around the heart, or the back of the heart, or the thighs, like thighs, pelvic floor, or the two prime areas there. When you start moving that, like understanding what that's about, and then it moves out, you suddenly have you have a lot more access, and you see things differently, and you can perceive your parents, for instance, differently, and things like that. So I want to this is a side note, I want to just say that a lot of what we've done are processes that you don't know what happened till 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks in. My workshops never have the big state experience that then goes away 3 days after a workshop. It's the opposite. It's like a ticking time bomb of a positive way. You don't know if something's happened, and then 4 weeks later you're like, oh, I haven't done this thing anymore. Or, I actually had a proper conversation with my mother for the first time in years, right? Or whatever. So there's ways to work that system from the inside out, which is not very flashy, or from the outside in, which typically is like Tony Robbins style or whatever, right? Like, yeah, big openings, and then you go whoop, back into the pattern, right? So that's your first question is, it's the energy in the body, which of course affects the nervous system, which affects your ability to regulate, which affects the way you relate. And so that's a lot of the work we're doing here, which is the underpinning for relational work. Because essentially, and anybody who's ever been in a relationship knows that, is it doesn't matter how good your partner actually is, if you can't receive their goodness because you don't have that channel isn't open, or you don't actually even have a pattern for it, you're going to reject that. Right? That's why undoing these patterns is beneficial, not only for health and vitality, but for relationship, right? So then the next question was, is there universal energy coming in shamanic practice and stuff like that? So I'm always a bit leery of talking about such things, because you inevitably sound like a total nutter, right? It just sounds like a nut job. And yeah, so, it's like if I go, yes, the universal energy, it's like, oh, God. Yeah, I mean, I don't trust people who talk like that. So I don't talk like that. But that's not to say that there isn't things in our field that that can't be described, right? The unfathomable, ineffable. There are of course, we're networked in a really interesting way, right, as humans, and that's actually not so woo-woo, because that's how humans survived as long as they did, right? From the mirror neurons to energetic mirroring or sensing and stuff like that. And that, of course, also goes for, the universe and the world and the universe beyond that, right? Of course, I mean, only somebody very dense looks out here and doesn't get a hit of the enormous energy of nature, right? For instance, right? So of course there are all these things. And as you know, I work with some very famous artists and musicians, and particularly one of them will say specifically, I wake up and an entire song comes through me. So he of course he had to learn the skills to translate, but he describes, and so have composers like Beethoven or so, describe that they wake up or they hear an entire, it's like a download essentially, right? And that download is, where's it coming from, right? Well, the ethers, right? So however you want to say that. So there is enormous forces that you can make yourself a vessel of. And we've all had that, at times where you feel that suddenly your body was open enough, or your heart was open enough, or you were relaxed enough that something could just come through you, right? This happens a lot when you, of course, teach or counsel or stuff as well. The words come out of your mouth, you're like, what the hell? And then somebody goes, that's exactly how it is, right? And it's like, of course, some of that is just distinction, but some of it is also something bigger than you, of course, right? But like I said, talking about it is questionable because these things are so unknowable that putting words on it immediately cheapens and denigrates the experience, of course, right? I do want to say, though, and I was going to tell you this anyway in this Q&A, so this was a great cue. One of the things that I have gotten really into in the last 10 years, when I first discovered it as an emerging field, I was like, this makes so much sense, is epigenetics, right? And so epigenetics essentially is a field in which they have now discovered that there is these methylated chains on the outside of your DNA. So it's not your actual DNA, but it's on the outside of the DNA that hold information. And based on the information they hold, they shut off or open gene expression. That's the best I can explain it. Mark, you probably could explain this better, but ask Mark. He's we'll talk about that later, what Mark is. But Mark is a specialist he's a microbiologist, right? Amongst other things. He has a PhD in microbiology, amongst many other smart things that come out of Mark. But I'm saying this to say these methylated chains hold information, they now think 6 to 8 generations back. So if your great-great-great-great-grandmother was almost eaten by a wolf, that or had experienced war and other horrible things, which all of our great-grandparents, grandparents, great-grandparents did, because the world is has always been a very violent place. Those things are in your epigenetics. And so depending on where they sit and what they do, they can really fuck with your gene expression. They can turn things off, they can turn the wrong things on. And so the epigenetic trauma really informs who we are. And that's, there's lots of research out on that. Obviously they've done a lot of research with mice and stuff, which I'm not a fan of, but whatever. But, in mice, I think, and in ravens, you can track things, in ravens particularly, because they're so smart, you can track things 8-10 generations down. So the 10 generations up, a raven experiences something, it travels down the entire chain. And so that's also true for humans. And so now, of course, the research immediately went to how can we make a medication out of this, right? Because that's how it always goes. And in that research, and this is no surprise to anybody who is into this stuff, they have found that there are many tried and true processes to clear those methylated chains. Anybody want to take a guess? Movement. So rhythmic movement, number one, rhythmic movement. Drumming, rattles, smudging, ethno-botanicals, ritual, all of those things, but particularly rhythmic movement in a ritual setting, and things of that nature do an insanely good job, right? So do ethno-botanicals, right? Some better than others, but in general, you can, a combination of such things clears your ethno-botanicals or mushrooms or ayahuasca or whatever, right? Like, so psychedelics, but there is also ethno-botanicals that are not super psychedelic, but have very strong effects, like iboga, for instance. Yeah, people quit heroin with iboga and stuff like that. So, yeah. So, and by the way, now there's like a whole research facility in Mexico where they send like Navy SEALs or people who've had like really, really gnarly post-traumatic stress, and they work with ayahuasca and iboga and MDMA as well on clearing the trauma. And so, but they also use like drumming, chanting, smudging, ritual cleansing with water and stuff like that. So I'm saying all of this to say that the tried and true methods for clearing your, epigenetic trauma and of course other traumas are in the shamanic realm, right? There are things that have been passed down for many, many generations. So we could most certainly say, regardless of how we talk about universal energy, we know two things. We know that a human who is open and relaxed is a vessel, right, for all energy, and we know that shamanic practices work, right? And so when we do things like freeing your mother lineage, we are availing ourselves of, millions of years of technology, so to speak, right? And it does have an effect, right? It always has an effect because these things work in the body, in certain ways. And so now your third question was strong emotion. Yeah. This is off topic, but Steve just interviewed a guy who wrote a biography that he researched for a long period of time of Castaneda. So look for that interview. It's coming out soon. But I think this is not only Castaneda, it's many traditions that are based on practice. The need for discipline is intense simply because of everything I've talked about before, which is you have to install patterns of practice or patterns of behavior or patterns of knowledge into your body, and the only way to do that is by constant repetition. Right? So the discipline piece is a no-brainer in the context of nothing you do can be installed without discipline, right? You're not going to become a good musician or a good artist or a good anything unless you go at it. And in the realm of skill acquisition, little and often is better than once a week for hours. And so that brings us to the daily discipline, and within discipline, then you can, of course, stack your practices so that they have optimal effect. And, doing bodily practices with cognitive practices, with meditation practice, you can stack things so you get optimal discipline. I'm not saying he's not right. It wouldn't be the way I would go at it. And the reason I wouldn't go at it is that what we associate with strong emotions is cathartic experience on one end, and on the other end, pushing people beyond their boundaries, both of which are state experiences. And the problem with a state experience is that your stage needs to catch up with your state. So another way of saying that is your development is a certain way, and because of that development, you hold a certain expertise and shape and ability emotionally as well as other ways, right? And so you can turbocharge beyond that by creating something that produces strong emotion. And that, like I said, that's commonly done in workshops, right? State pumping, essentially, where you create an exalted state, so to speak, that opens something beyond your ability. Now, if you're perfectly healthy and the state experience is held in an immaculate container, that can be amazing, right? Which is, by the way, why it's never a good idea to go to one of those internet shamans, who've like done, some kind of training that, and then they hand you the ayahuasca, but they have no idea of actually hold that space, or even without psychedelics. So you have to have immaculate set and setting, so to speak, and you have to have aftercare, and you can only do that if you're really emotionally and bodily and mentally healthy. If you are not, meaning if you have certain kinks and contractions, the energy of the state will pop those temporarily open, which is why people love that. But then that opening happened on a scar, so to speak. It happened on an injury. So the scar pops open, and then when it closes, the scar is a bit more often. Also often, in order to create the big opening, people, and that's a lot of what happens, right? People have to know where you've been hurt. And they make you do things along the line of where you've been hurt. And then, it's the go beyond your boundaries. That's where and so a good state pumper knows how to push your pain button, your injury button, or your trauma button. And then you might have a great experience, but you might also suddenly find yourself face down in a ditch without clothes, and need 10 years to reconcile that the guru did some weird shit to you, right? That's in the same category, because when somebody knows how to play your contraction, they can produce the opening, but they can also really take you somewhere where you don't want to go. So that's why I would be careful with the strong emotion. It's true, but it has to be immaculately done. Yeah. There are things that in all shamanic traditions that produce that, but typically they're held very strictly, and they're self-guided and not guided by someone. So if you hit something that's a bit too much, your system will just go, okay, enough, or that was fine, right? So there's a self-regulation. But if I'm on you, let's say, and I'm forcing you to go further than you want to go naturally, I can maybe produce a big opening, but then I'm also producing a scar. So self-guided strong emotion much better than led strong emotion. Yeah. And, psychotherapeutically, they've, done lots of research on the fact that catharsis actually doesn't work at all.